Slutsky over here. Warm applause. He's a data science consultant, heavily involved in the Scicloj community, frequent talker at the London Clojure group, and also a trained yoga teacher. And today we're hearing Sci for science.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So inspiring that you made a conference happen this way. Really amazing. And yeah, so we'll talk about the small Clojure interpreter and how it is, of course, relevant for scientific computing. My mother recently helped me recollect some old childhood memories, and you see, I used to play with clay. Do you use clay sometimes? Yeah? Yeah, so, you know, I experienced that it was tricky to find stability in movement and shape, and you see my dear dinosaur friend, she dropped her tail years ago, and you also see I learned to appreciate simple shapes, right? And the way they could be stable. And Clojure, of course, has its own take on mobility and stability and change and movement and all that. And we learn to appreciate the stability culture of Clojure and also the way we can play with it joyfully. And then now today we ask what it means for data exploration and science, and we'll have this short session with a data set. And recently we had talks telling that Clojure is relevant for physics, for biology, so this time it will be geography. And I think this session and everything we're talking about is kind of relevant to anybody who may have some data to explore and play with. And there is this nice Berlin cycling count data set where, you know, there are those stations where people sit and count the bicycles passing, and maybe a few of you have been counted there in the data, right? And we'll play with it a little bit later. I'm Daniel. I'm part of the Scicloj community. I'm a community organizer. That's what I do. And in the last few weeks and months, I have been affected by a few of the friends mentioned here. Lucas is here with us today, and the Visual Tools group. It has been affecting me a lot. This space where we think about tooling and our visual flow with Clojure and data. And Clay is one of the tools we have been discussing at the Visual Tools group, and it will be the tool we experience today, but that's not the point. It is just one of those tools. And the point, I think, is the dilemmas we will be discussing about how we approach data visually and how we document our process. And, you know, thinking about, you know, this balance between stability and mobility we discussed, what it means for a scientific process, for exploring data, what should it look like, right? And I guess the answer might be, yeah, we want to enjoy the playfulness, the joy of the REPL and be very dynamic about the process, but we need some self-documenting way so that we create something that stays with us, a story of what we did. And Clay is just one of those ways to do that. And here's a little example of something that we can do with Clay. So this presentation is built with the Clay tool, and that is already probably familiar to Clojure people, that we can take a piece of code and create some visual result and also have it in a document. And here we see in action the cycling count data set, but also a few of the amazing libraries in the data science stack. Tablecloth about, you know, processing data in this nice ergonomic way. And behind Tablecloth, of course, the high-performance TechML dataset library. And Hanami, this data visualization library, which is so flexible in creating plots. And also some gluing layer, which is connecting a few of these, smoothing out and hiding a few of the data conversions between them. So nowadays you have this experience for data processing and visualization, and you have a few tools which are connecting to that. But what is actually happening here? So you see, I have a namespace, a Clojure namespace, which is the source of truth for this presentation, and I can find the code and I have this code. And I can render the whole namespace as a presentation in this case, but I can also render a single value, a single Clojure form, so I can send this to be visualized. And you see we have this plot, oh, is it a different plot? Oh yeah, it's a different one, right, so, sorry, it was this one. Yeah, that's the one we were looking into. So, right, we see the change of counts in the different stations along the weeks of the year, 2020. And we can change a few things, and you know, it is so tempting to just change the code a little bit and maybe not take the week but the date, and maybe then the date we should say that it is of temporal type, it is a date. And that's the ergonomics of this Hanami library, and then we can visualize it, and you see now we can see the structure of the week, those changes which are typical to all places in the city, so it looks right. And so we have this dynamic process of exploration, but also we want to generate a document, right? So we can have another key binding that can generate a document. I think all of this is not so much surprising because we have a few tools that do that nowadays, and maybe let us look into the plot again, and then there is another way to render the whole thing as a document, and that is this Quarto tool. Quarto, we'll talk about it in a moment. It is this scientific publishing system that allows creating beautiful documents with themes and fonts and customizable details, and also this book-like experience or the slides of a reveal.js presentation. So all of that is very much doable with this Quarto system, and we can target it as the data we create, and we'll talk about it more in a moment. So you see, that's what we do in Clay. We visualize a single form or create a whole document, and it is part of this scene of many notebook-like tools, and many of these, it is just a partial list, many of these are going around this culture called namespace as a notebook, where the source of truth of the visual documents you're creating is a namespace, is a Clojure namespace. And of all of these, Clay is maybe the least clever one, and we'll talk a bit about its principle. So one of them is do less. And you know, just between these two things, your namespace and a notebook, a document you're creating, a lot of amazing interactions may happen, and Clay does not try to do so much over there. It tries to flow with the REPL. It tries to be compatible with the usual REPL experience, where, you know, we have your editor and the REPL, you evaluate stuff and you experience the flow of things. So Clay tries to flow with that and just allow this visual view it creates. And it creates static output. It means it creates eventually HTML documents where the text is just HTML text and so on. And it is lightweight and search engine friendly and all that. And it follows this kindly convention that we're discussing in the visual tools group, which is a way to specify how a given Clojure form, in what kind of way it should be rendered. And this kindly convention is nowadays supported by a few of the relevant tools, and Clay is one of them. And the API is basically, you know, mostly three actions: taking a Clojure form and turning it into an HTML page, turning a whole namespace and turning it into an HTML page, and going through this Quarto system, which is a bit slower, but allows us to create a page which is all the Quarto qualities, like these reveal.js slides. And yeah, and Quarto, by the way, is not only a data format, this extension of Markdown, the QMD format. It is also a very dynamic system that has really great connections to existing tools and IDEs. But to make that connect with our Clojure flow, we still need to figure out a few concurrency problems, and it is not working yet. So hopefully it will be much faster to use and connect not just with Clay after we figure out those questions. So that's Quarto. You should look it up. Anyway, I think not just in this context. It's an amazing system. And yeah, and Clay documents can contain reagent component for interactivity. So here is just a simple example. And you see the kindly convention asks us to say this is hiccup, because, you know, arguably reagent is an extension of hiccup. So that's the kind of way a thing would be visualized. And then you see it is just a component. You have the component as a function, which is what reagent does, and then you have some data passed to the function and you will have it working. But how does it work in a static document? So yeah, Scittle, of course. Thank you for Scittle. Thank you so much for Scittle, right? And yeah, so Scittle is this way to have the SCI interpreter running in an HTML page. And so that's it. I think everything we see here is very much unsurprising after we know Scittle exists and you can run the interpreter. And yeah, and maybe another connection to the backend is going the other way around and allowing the reagent components to ask the backend to compute something. So here we have an example doing that. And this brings up some questions, right? Because, you know, we said we wanted to have our REPL session have this self-documenting quality where we have some emerging document from our REPL session, and we want it to be a static document. But if it relies on backend computation, then what happens after the backend is not anymore available, right? When we serve our document on the web. So maybe that's the most interesting question in this session, and we'll not talk a lot about it, but I think it is not only a trouble, but it also brings up some opportunities, because if you go through a certain API asking your backend questions, then that could be a self-documenting process. You could record all your requests to the document and generate a more detailed namespace with all these requests explicitly mentioned there, kind of a storytelling of what we did interactively. And I had a good conversation with our friend Thomas Clerk about it, and there are some good ideas. Too fragile to be demonstrated now, but I think it is one of the things that we want to explore more. And you know, I played with clay recently, not only as a child, but in the last few years. So I hope to construct something. I had some shape in mind I hoped to create, and then I realized I couldn't, right? That's how it is with clay. I couldn't create the shape I wanted. And I realized what I could do was kind of flow with the material, right? And have this spiral movement, and then have some emerging shape realized, uncovered by the movement of the material and myself together. Not what I pre-imagined, not what I engineered. And so that was it was an experience that kind of taught me about, not just about clay, about that time I had a foot injury, and then it was teaching me about how to treat my own soft tissues and how to move with them. And then also, of course, I think this kind of approach to flow with the material, it is relevant to emotions, to community, and to technical stuff as well. And let us have a little REPL session just to get a feeling of our data. And so, right, we have these cyclist counts where we have, you know, those stations around Berlin counting how many people go a few times a day. And then I built like a tiny linear regression or log linear, actually, never mind about it, model to predict at a given point in time how many cyclists we expect to pass through a station. And I took into account a few of the relevant details, like how it has been in the last few days, and how it was the same time of the year last year, and what day of week it is, right? We saw that. That is, of course, very relevant. And then the typical practice when you have a model of your data is to look into the residuals, where your data is kind of surprising with respect to the model, where it gives more or less compared to what the model predicted. So that is what we do now. So we have this series along 2020. Last time we met, for a few of us, right? 2020, this strange year where many things changed through the year, and that is one of the ways to look into those changes, to see how much we were surprised at given points in time, with respect to cyclists passing around. And so what this plot shows is that at a given point in time, it might be that at a certain station, the stations are colored by a different color, right? At a certain station, we may have more or less than what we expect to see. So here, for example, February, March, and April, we had those specific days where we did have less in all stations, right? And that's the lockdown and all that, we remember 2020. And then at some days we have more, right? We have, sometimes it happened that we were all surprised compared to next year, compared to recent days, compared to the day of week. Something happens and there are more cyclists running around. And I think this practice of looking into the strange points and diving into them is kind of important. And we can look into specifically this part of the end of September, which is kind of interesting. And we see that we have this surprise of too few cyclists, and then too many, and what is happening. And we have these very specific stations where it was actually more of these too many. The surprise was bigger. And then we may want to look into it locally and have a map of the stations. You see, we have those stations colored by how much we are surprised by the number of cyclists in a given day, this specific end of September, and we see specific stations where this number was big, and we can dive in and click them and see, you know, what was happening along the year for these specific stations and how this day was special. And that's the kind of local analysis we want to do. In geography, you may wish to be very local at some point and try to see that things are making sense locally. And we'll not dive into the details, but, and yeah, I couldn't figure out all those spikes we saw earlier, but there was this event in this special day, and then, you know, possibly that is part of the reason for specific stations. And that's the kind of thing you may need to do, to dive into the data and make the story specific. And then I asked our friend Santiago, who is not here today, he's in Portugal, and Santiago, who is a bike person in Berlin, told me, yeah, it could be that the spike we saw was by this special event that occurred in 2020. Yeah, so that's a little experience of the process, which is very much dynamic, and you know, we could play with the code and change a little bit, and we'll not do it now because of time, but it is a dynamic process. We don't know from the very beginning what we are designing. We are uncovering facts, and we want that process to be self-documenting. Clay is attempting to do that, and there are still some challenges, of course, as we discussed. And yeah, maybe we'll just discuss a little bit of our future hopes. So regarding this practice of creating static documents, so yeah, Clay itself needs to be decomplected. It is kind of a double process where first we are taking a namespace and turning it into some data format representing what needs to be visualized, and then there is another step, which is actually generating this HTML or Quarto document that we saw. And the plan is to decomplect it this way, so that there will be this middle step that takes some general data format and turns it into an HTML or Quarto markdown document. And I think this middle part is kind of exciting. It is relevant to other needs and tasks, and I hope to share it and kind of think about it together and make it very clear about, you know, what we could make it happen in that part. And a few of the relevant ways to visualize data are already supported in this static rendering way, but there are more that could be there, and certainly Portal is one of the amazing collections of data viewers, different ways to visualize and navigate in data, and it could be made part of static documents, and just doesn't work for me yet, but it will. And yeah, and another topic we have been discussing yesterday is literate testing, how to make our documents testable, and yeah, and we did discuss these dilemmas around the relationship with the backend, and this wish to be more dynamic with the way we consume this Quarto tool, which can be very much dynamic. And by the way, that can be an amazing Babashka project, just connecting to the concurrency problems of Quarto from a Clojure settings. And yeah, regarding community, we are building a data and science community. Yes, it is relevant to anybody who has some data to explore. And I'll just mention a few projects we're working on. So one of them is probably well known. It is this data cookbook that Kira McLean is working on. It will be an entry point to the story of the emerging stack of libraries for data and science and visualization and all that. And it's very much related to what we're discussing now. And there is another project which is the scrapbook, which is kind of similar to the cookbook, but never so tidy as the cookbook. Not very much polished and edited, but rather very much open to contributions. Oh, thank you. Oh, thanks so much. And then another one is the study group, the real world data study group that will begin probably in the end of June. And that will be a space for anybody who may wish to explore their data, bring their data projects and use a group as a space to share experiences and think together about data and science. Theodore, by the way, thank you for your comments about the real world data group. It really influenced me a lot and kind of you helped me realize what it should be, and we'll discuss it, I imagine. And we are planning some flow of content between these different projects so that we'll have this emerging collection of documents of our experiences with data. And now maybe it is a time for discussion with the little time we have, and I think maybe one thing I could ask you, or maybe kind of provoke you to think, is where are the soft tissues we can play with now? What materials we wish to flow with in our current situation as a tech community? And you know, nowadays those software systems are becoming uncertain, right? And we're getting used to the fact that we have those components that we're never so sure about what they do, and we kind of try to flow with them, but with very much kind of surprise about what emerges. And maybe we could embrace this approach of trying to flow and see what happens. Thank you.
I'm really curious about the intermediate representation you were picturing between the input formats and the output formats. And in my head, that has kind of been something related to Pandoc's intermediate representation. I'm curious about your thoughts. It does make sense to kind of find an existing format and then build on top of it? Or should we, as a community, agree on something, or what do you think?
Wow, thank you. That is great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so QMD, Quarto Markdown, this format that a Quarto tool can render into HTML and PDF and all kinds of outputs. In a sense, it is very much related to the Pandoc conversion. I don't know very much about it, but it is very similar to what you're proposing, I think. And then we have a tool that takes that and renders it in a very customizable way, and that's Quarto. I think there is a middle step between the namespace and that is maybe some common Clojure data format, and that could be imagined, and that could be hopefully a convention across tools. Yes, so thank you for offering that. That's the hope, yeah.
I just want to clarify that while Pandoc supports common markdown, it has an internal JSON representation, which can be pure Clojure if we just do it as Clojure.
Oh, I haven't thought about it. I haven't known. Thank you. Thanks.
More questions? We have time. Thank you for the talk. There's another similar package called Clerk.
Yeah.
What's the difference? Could you tell us if there is some difference?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Clerk is a wonderful tool, which is, again, I believe, part of this scene that can be called namespace as a notebook. And I think, yeah, the point of this talk was not necessarily to focus on Clay, but to bring up the dilemmas we have about what happens when we explore data and want to create a document eventually. And yeah, and Clerk offers such an interesting way to do that. And yeah.
Does Clay work in Babashka? Because Clerk doesn't yet.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So, no, and that hasn't been a central use case, but it should be simple, right? After we figure out this thing that kind of we're proposing here, this tiny data format that says what needs to be rendered, then the process generating it is actually so tiny and simple. There is almost nothing there. So yeah, I would love to try to run it on a different runtime. Yeah.
We can document our scripts.
Yeah.
I'm secretly trying to set up a competition between you and Clerk. No pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great actually. And maybe, so unless there is any other question, maybe I hope to encourage you to look into this new study group that will begin very soon. And really, thank you, Theodore, again, for kind of affecting me in realizing what it should be. And that will be a space where we explore data together and meet probably bi-weekly and kind of experience our methods and practices. And yeah, and let us talk if any of that could be relevant for you. Thanks.